Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Future of Strategy First working lunch on the subject, how can we standardise sustainability in a meaningful way? When I first found a title for this session, I wanted to call it ESG Anything But Standard, for the very simple reason that all of us are feeling our way a little bit with the sustainability agenda. None of us has a background necessarily in what makes trade sustainable, but what we have agreed so far is that sustainable trade really should be about making sure that we are conducting trade in a way that creates sustainable solutions. And we don't mean that just in terms of the environment. We mean that in terms of creating decent work for communities, human rights, and also good governance as well. So it's making trade, if you like, circular. It's allowing trade to contribute positively to sustainable development goals. So with me to discuss all of this, I'm absolutely delighted to say we have Jo Wissing from Credit Suisse, but she's also on the chair of the ESG committee of the ITFA. And we also have Tod Burwell, who is the president of BAFT. Now, we're expecting Andrew Wilson, who is the global policy director of the ICC, to join us imminently, but he's been delayed getting to COP26 this morning. So we're going to run this by ourselves to start with. What I would say, I had an extraordinary experience just as we were running through the rehearsal to this session, which was this. Tod and Jo have never actually met each other before. And I was astonished because in terms of the trade and trade finance community, it's a relatively small world. So I think this is the first time where I have the pleasure of bringing two very fantastic people together like this. So welcome. Tod, maybe I could turn to you first. And this, by the way, everyone, this is a very informal session, and do interrupt and get the conversation going, because this is about how we as trade finance professionals start to measure sustainable trade in a meaningful way. But Tod, if I could come to you first, would you mind running us through some of the things that BAFT is doing in this space?
Sure. So thank you for having me, and glad to join the discussion. I'm actually hoping to learn as much as I can share, perhaps even more. So from a sustainability and ESG point of view, this has been a topic of discussion within BAFT, or I'd say probably 6 years, going all the way back to the Sustainable Trade Finance Council that was formed under CISL leadership several years ago that we were involved in. And then, to be quite honest, the topic sort of died down in discussion, and our members were focused on some other things. But what's been renewed has been an interest in how to drive the adoption of certain behaviors and practices. We've started to see senior commitments from members of the financial services community, and where 6 months ago I was having discussions with bankers, and they really quietly would tell me that their sustainability finance capabilities were somewhat competitive at that time. There's now much more of a call for standards, for collaboration, for consistency and agreement across broader industry. So what we've been trying to do is to identify, okay, so what exactly is needed? Because we know there's been a ton of work that's already been done. There's a ton of work that's left to do. And the last thing we want to do is to become standard, number 401, because there are about 400 standards out there now. So when we started to boil it down, there were about 21 different things our members were asking us for. We said that's still way too many. But I think the consistent things that we're hearing specifically for our community is, how do you define sustainability for, specifically in our case, the transaction banking product suite? So it includes trade, it includes sustainable deposits, and may include overnight investments, or anything that may be part of the transaction banking suite of products. So how do you know that something is sustainable or not? Second is really, can we get some consistency around how we measure it, how we report it, how we capture it? Because ultimately, in order to drive adoption, we think that there needs to be a data case, and you can't have a data case until you get agreement on what it is that you're trying to measure. So we've launched a working group really just a couple of weeks ago that's going to be focused on trying to get consistent definitions across transaction banking. And we realize the ICC has already done a bunch of work on this. So we're going to try to layer on top of what they've done and build around what they've done rather than get in the way of what they've done. I think the second thing, again, is really around reporting and making sure that we can get to a granular level of detail for the community to understand what they can do and how they should go about doing it. And I think a big one that we've been hearing is there are more and more banks that commit to being part of the Net Zero Banking Alliance. I think it's now up to 90 plus banks that represent about 43% of the world's banking assets. But these commitments are really coming from the C-level. So the question for us has been, so how do we apply that in the transaction banking context? And how far down into our supply chains or through our ecosystem do we really need to go? And I think that's going to be a big topic we'll try to tackle in our working group.
Thank you very much. So, I mean, I guess the way I would summarize that is to say we're all at the start of a journey, that we're trying to understand what we need to measure, and that there's kind of a regulatory push, which to some extent is coming from a C-suite, probably interacting with the regulators and understanding what's going on, but increasingly the pressures are beginning to emerge that are lower down as well, so that it's actually about helping companies to improve their supply chains. And Joe, I think there's something very interesting here. You know, I mean, obviously I have some insider information because I sit on the ESG committee as well of ITFA, but maybe what we're trying to do here is try and bring banks and businesses closer together. What's ESG doing in this, the ITFA doing in this space?
Yeah, there's lots for sure, and thank you, Rebecca, first of all for setting all this up and for the introduction, and also for two very great sessions already this morning. I must say it was fantastic to listen to those panels, and certainly a few takeaways I had from that was around, again, is around what is sustainable trade. How can we define it and how can we standardize it, right? And I think the consensus was there isn't that sort of like definition or standardization yet, because this whole field is pretty new, especially when we look at it in the broader banking context. It's a very new sort of like thing when it comes to transaction banking, and then even more so when it comes to trade finance. And I guess why is that? Well, I'd say one of the reasons for sure is because trade itself is rather complex, right? I mean, all of us who are in it and practicing it, we're all saying it's not rocket science, but it's because we do it every day. But I think for people looking in from the outside, and I feel that here when I'm talking to my colleagues who are so knowledgeable and so sort of like experienced in the overall ESG space, but when I talk to them about trade finance, it's still a little bit more of a like, oh yeah, we are working on that, but give us your input, basically.
Yeah.
So I think, and we were talking a lot about supply chains this morning and all that kind of good stuff, and I'm sure a lot of that will come out in the session as we speak. Trying to just say very briefly in a nutshell, what's it for trying to do around that? As you rightly say, Rebecca, the ESG committee is still a fairly new thing, if not to say we're still, of course, recruiting members, aren't we? And maybe there is a call for people interested on this call in case we can get one or two more interested ones. But overall, ITFA has certainly seen that need arise to have someone within the board focus specifically on this field. Before we created that ESG function. There was lots of work already going on the topic within ITFA, but it was more around different board members who were focusing on different fields such as market practice, insurance, etc., looking into specific aspects rather than having a dedicated sort of like resource to that. And certainly, of course, the reason why we're doing that is because we see that it's the defining moment now of our time, isn't it? And we are really at such a turning point where finally this topic is all over, and it's not just sort of like a nice to have anymore, or a roll my eyes, whatever on it. I'd say within the committee, what are we aiming to do? Definitely, it's probably around. Well, I normally like to break it to 3 pillars, but really it is about 5 pillars. So it's about education, it's about promotion, in terms of like promoting initiatives, promoting, for example, also certain technologies, etc. And it's about lobbying and advocating. So, for example, working with regulators on getting lower capital weightings, etc. And then, of course, the other 2 big aspects that play into this is standardization and having definitions, which to me play into all these 3: educate, promote, and advocate. But yeah, that's really what we're striving to do. What we certainly don't want to do is sort of like duplicate an effort made by the ICC or made by BAFT in that space, and that's why it's great that we are collaborating. And as I said to Tod when we met briefly before the session virtually, it was about time, and I'm really glad because I'm sure we will be speaking lots in future, and definitely there is a lot of sort of like collaboration required in this field because of its complexity.
So, I mean, again, what I'm hearing is this is the start of a journey. And I mean, to a novice sitting outside, it must seem, or even to somebody who is a sustainability expert sitting outside, it must seem extraordinary that we're all sitting here saying it's a new area. Because I was just talking this through over the weekend, trying to work out when it was that Al Gore put the Inconvenient Truth film out there, and it was over 20 years ago, you know, so this isn't something that is new. You know, Lord Nicholas Stern in this country wrote a report saying unless economists wake up to the costs of not becoming more sustainable, then we're in trouble. Now, this is something that we've been aware of for a very long time. We've all sat at university and in student classes talking about the planet. We've got to get beyond greenwash. So this issue of sustainability is very, very, very important, and standardization is very, very important. So, I mean, the ICC is working with a very complex framework. So it's got complexity baked into everything that it's doing. So it's looking across supply chains, different elements of supply chains. It's producing its report, as I said. There's a full report on standardization coming out, which is effectively a white paper and a call to action for all of us to feedback, and it's coming out on Wednesday. Now, the issue with all of that is, are we right to start with something complicated? And Andrew has joined totally seamlessly, just at the moment where we need him, bang on cue. I have to say that was perfect timing, Andrew. Thank you very much, because I was about to abuse what the ICC is doing in this space. Go for it.
Rebecca, just for context, you want me to talk about what we're doing in the ESG space?
Yes, please.
Super. So just to give everyone a little bit of background, I'm sorry for joining from a slightly unconventional location. I'm currently on my way to COP26.
Car. I hope it's
a hybrid. At least it's halfway there. But essentially, we're aware that there is a huge amount of pressure for the financial system to become more sustainable. And we think, in particular, trade is potentially vulnerable to civil society pressure, perhaps unfairly in many respects, not just around climate, but particularly in the biodiversity space, which we think will come into sharp relief next year as the revision of the Convention on Biological Diversity accelerates. So we think it's important to at least put a stake in the ground to see what can be done to render trade more sustainable, and trade finance specifically within that. So what we've been doing over the last 2 months is to work with a group of banks and corporates, 250 in total, including brand name multinationals right the way down to small and medium-sized enterprises and banks from 5 different continents, is really to try and look at how do we define what constitutes sustainable trade. And that in itself is difficult. The definition is contested. Is selling fossil fuels, or is the sale of fossil fuels to emerging markets sustainable if it supports economic development? Just as one example of a question we've had to wrestle with. So definition of what constitutes sustainable trade that we hope over time can at least be adopted at scale by the market. And then within that, what we're trying to build, at least in the first instance, is a methodology or an architecture to allow banks and corporates to assess the sustainability profile of individual transactions, looking at 5 key aspects of any given transaction. So the buyer, the seller, the nature of the goods, the mode of transportation, and crucially, the intent of the transaction. So this is far more complex than many of the sustainability standards that exist for other financial instruments, such as bonds. And within that, we hope at least to be able to put a stake in the ground to start a discussion about what is a robust framework. So how do we push back on some of the civil society pressure we've seen in relation to trade and trade finance activities in recent months and years? But also we're very conscious that this needs to be a workable standard. And this is where we're particularly keen over the next few months to consult extensively with industry, both banks and corporates, to make sure that anything we do finally put out into the market is actually workable in practice. And we're very conscious of some of the issues that have arisen around KYC requirements for financial crimes, some of the difficulties banks have actually implementing those. So we're aware that we need to get the tension right between a robust standard that meets the expectations of civil society, quite understandably, but also something that is applicable in the real world, in practice. So what you will see on Wednesday is simply essentially a positioning paper, working through the feedback we've received from banks and corporations to date, that will set out a definition of sustainable trade and trade finance for consultation and a framework. And really, in looking at the framework, we want to get as much feedback as possible as to whether we've got the standards correct, whether banks can reasonably implement the framework we've suggested in millions and millions of transactions every year, and whether our idea to rely on existing industry standards for different sectors and industries is the right way to go, or whether we need to go back to the drawing board. So it may be on Wednesday we upset everyone, banks and corporates alike. We hope not. We hope we've got a good first step on the journey, but we're very conscious that this will probably be quite a long journey ahead to get the approach right.
Thank you very much indeed. And I think one of the takeaways for me from all of that is just the complexity and of all of this. Now, everyone listening in, I hope, will know that we have launched the Cosmos Consortium, which is an attempt to simplify all of this and to work with the ICC and BAFT and ITFA on making sure that we can simplify this. And I'm about to tell you the reason why we branded this Cosmos. It's because Alexander von Humboldt went around the world measuring all the species, all the biodiversity. He was kind of Germany's measurement equivalent of Darwin, and he went around the entire world doing all of this, and then wrote a massive book called Cosmos, which was basically about measuring the world and measuring the sustainability around the world. Now I guess my question is always, and it's for all of you really, and I just say to everyone else, do jump in because I don't want to hold the mic here, but as I'm beginning to work on standardizing things that we can actually do something about, so we can do something about a product, we can measure how sustainable a product is through its supply chains, those are things that we can automate. Are we in danger of literally missing the wood for the trees if we make life too complicated? Sorry about the joke. They're very bad and I will change. Joe, Todd, what do you say? I mean, it's a brilliant, I mean, we have to start somewhere. Do we start complicated and summarize, or do we start with a summary and then go more detailed?
I think, you know, I'm a big believer that you kind of start at the end, right? Which is to figure out what are you trying to ultimately solve for, and what are you ultimately trying to do, and where are you ultimately trying to go, and then work your way backwards to where you are, and from that you can sort of figure out which direction you need to order your steps. And so if what we're ultimately trying to solve for is to change behavior in trade or change behavior in supply chains and so forth, then I think we need to start with the most complex understanding, which is how do you get the smallest supplier in a supply chain to practice sustainable behavior such that you can have a truly sustainable supply chain. Now, that's going to be scarily complex if you look at it in those terms. But if you can ultimately solve for that last mile, you won't get to where you're trying to get to. And so I think when you, at least from my perspective, when you walk that backwards, you do have to start with what Andrew alluded to, which is what is sustainable trade? How do you define what it is, what it's not? And then you start to talk about how do you measure it? What Joe had brought up earlier around advocacy, what I've learned in my couple of years here at BAFT is don't ever go into a discussion with the regulator without the data to support what you're talking about, okay? It just will not end well. And so you can't really have a data conversation until you know what you're measuring and there's some integrity in that measurement. So I think we are starting in the right place with trying to define what is sustainable trade and how do we measure it. And then we can get to some of the next discussions about how we drive adoption. And ultimately, we will get to a place where we can make arguments for incentivizing this behavior through either capital relief or other measures like that.
Yeah, and if I may add to that, I totally agree, by the way, Todd. I see what you're saying in terms of, Rebecca, that there is a danger of, and sorry, I'm going to reuse your joke now, that there is a danger of missing the wood between the trees for the forest. But I absolutely agree, though, that we'll need to go this at sort of like, in a way, the most detailed and granular level before we can then break it into sort of like different ratings, for example, if you so want to say. And that's of course what you're doing with Cosmos, which is fantastic to actually get us to a point by which we can really create sustainability ratings linked to the UN SDGs, for example, and EU Taxonomy, etc. I think, and in that context, certainly, as Todd is saying, what we really need is we need some standards and a common ground that we can work off, because what might mean ESG for one part, you might not mean the same for another. And to make this all more difficult and more complex is certainly that we need to find that equilibrium of the E, the S, and the G, right, which we're always talking about, and the terrible dichotomy, if you dichotomy, there we go, thank you. the terrible dichotomy that, of course, if we look, for example, at fossil fuels and the developing world, fossil fuels are quite essential for further growth of many of the countries in the developing world, and so therefore, from an E perspective, they're certainly really bad, but from an S perspective, there are something that in a way is possibly required. And I think to find that equilibrium, and then even go all the way down to sort of like the smallest suppliers in the chain is the true challenge. And yeah, we definitely therefore need standardization for sure.
So Andrew, in terms of, I mean, I think those points are really well made, Joe, and I think one of the things we have to think about is that, I mean, again, I'm going to sound horribly like an economist here, and I apologise, but it's about understanding the businesses as well as understanding the suppliers of finance. So it's understanding the demand side as well as the supply side. Andrew, what that's essentially what you've done, isn't it? You've brought together banks and businesses. So tell us more about where there are agreed terms in terms of standardization. What are businesses saying to you that they need from their banks and vice versa? And how does that help us understand what we're standardizing here?
Mm-hmm. So Rebecca, we thought it was vital that this was an initiative where we brought together both banks and a range of corporates. We didn't feel like this was an initiative that could be driven solely through our banking commission, which would be our usual modus operandi for the trade finance market. I think one of the reasons I'm stuck in this car is the protests just outside Glasgow blocking the roads this morning. And I think it's those types of people, and I don't say this in any sort of negative sense, but it's the pressure we're seeing from civil society to say trade is destroying the planet or fossil fuels are destroying the planet overlooks the basic realities of everyday life, particularly in emerging markets. And that's why we think it's so vital that industry shows leadership in this area, which is why we wanted to bring at least a consultation framework or a draft standard to COP this week to show that industry is serious about this, is leading, and is actually willing to try and define that. Because I think if we leave the definitions to others, there's a risk of misunderstanding the complexities of trade. There's also a risk of ignoring the simple economics. One thing we've seen from the work we've done, and I think we've seen this both from banks and from corporates, is that there are already a lot of standards out there that are not necessarily meshed in today into the way that trade finance is provided. Things like better cotton, sustainable forestry standards, or if they're used, they're not used consistently across the market. So one thing our framework does is to rely, or at least we give the indication that we would, in future, if implemented, rely solely on existing industry standards. So we would identify best practice standards in each and every sector, and then essentially allow that to become an integral part of the framework. And I think we heard very clearly from both banks and corporates that there's no shortage of standards, no need for us to reinvent the wheel, and an absolute imperative that where standards exist, we use them. The one challenge we're aware of is what do you do in industries or sectors where those standards don't exist? Are there minimum standards you can refer back to in the absence of something industry or sector specific? Does the ICC or does another industry body need to actually go out and actually define those? But that's a challenge we'll come to as we run through the consultation process. But essentially, our idea is to rely on existing standards where they're reliable and accepted, and where not, to actually deal with that problem as we go through the second phase of the work, Q1, Q2 next year.
And it's a really important piece of work that you're doing. I guess my question is back to that point about the blah blah blah, and we were talking about this blah 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 syndrome. We were talking about this in the previous session as well. That you know that there is a complexity to all of this, and yes, there has been a lot of us talking about sustainability maybe in too much of a greenwashing sense over the last well 20-30 years, and we've thrown money at it and just hope the problem would go away, and of course that hasn't happened. But actually the most important thing now, and this is the purpose of our whole Future of Strategy event, is to bring everyone together. It wasn't a coincidence that we had this in the second week of COP either, because you know, we need to make sure that that it's hooked around the agenda when we know everybody is going to be talking about all of these things. So how do we actually move, and I'm going to ask this question, everyone will get bored of it, but how do we move beyond greenwashing in a sustainable way, in a way that gets to this point, which is the whole circular problem of one person's oil export is another person's energy source. It's really difficult, isn't it? Because this balance between emerging markets, developing markets, and what is done in developed markets has clustered up, not just in Paris, but in Tokyo before then. I mean, it's clustered up the sustainability agenda for donkey's years. So how do we get around it?
If maybe I might quickly start on this, Rebecca, but well, as you say, it would also be great to hear from the audience, I think, and I'm sure Tod and Andrew have got a lot of points on this. Again, well, we've already spoken a lot about standardization now, and I think that's what we need. We need sort of like a matrix sort of like environment, which is what Andrew has already spoken about, right? Something to allow, for example, to assess transactions and yeah, find that balance and that equilibrium to what one person's oil export is another sort of like person's livelihood in terms of like actually having access to energy. Certainly on the grand scale political level, I mean, following the coverage of COP over the last week, there is certainly, well, I would almost call it a cry for help from the developing world, who are saying, yes, we are on board with you, but you've promised us so much money in Paris, and there is still no sort of like clear line of sight of actually where there is going to be some investment, where it's going to come from, and we can't just do it all ourselves. And this is where I think one thing we currently maybe fail a bit to do is to highlight actually the opportunity. Failing on ESG is a business risk now, for sure. I think all of us on this call here agree on that. But I think what we sort of like forgotten so far about is to highlight more where the opportunity is, for example, in terms of infrastructure spend, and it's almost like this sort of like, well, there's a carrot and stick approach, isn't there? Where at the moment I see a lot of stick also on a policy level, and again, this is the irony that policy is normally made in Western capitals, but again, the largest majority of the world population lives in the developing world. So there is, I see at the moment, I see too much stick and too little carrot. And again, it's quite complex how we can figure out what should get the carrot and what shouldn't, but that's something that we need to work on together as an industry.
Tod, I agree completely. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so you know, I guess I'm still back to, and I'm going to sound like a little bit of a pessimist at times, although I want to assure you that personally I've bought in. But there's another side to the coin, right? And one of the difficulties that I've heard from banks in particular, and still hear from banks, is the business case, and that was really a question that confounded many of us. It's like as individual citizens, I think a strong majority can understand the need to do something about climate change. We can understand the need to do something about certain social issues and things of that nature. What I hear, again, candidly, from some banks, as well as some businesses, and again, it's very privately, is what's the business case for me doing this? We as a global society ought to do something, but does that mean that I need to stop doing the business that I'm doing because that business sees itself as doing some social good in and of itself? So it brings me back to a couple of words that I've been hearing locally here within the US recently, which is transition and adaptation. And I think ultimately what I'm hearing now at COP and in other places is a commitment, which is important, right? You have to say, I'm committed to doing X by 2050 or by 2030 or what have you. So you have businesses, you have banks, you have government putting stakes in the ground. There has to be some recognition and acknowledgement that there will need to be a transition period. There will need to be a commitment to both financing the adaptation of moving from where we are today to a more greener environment. And then the question will be, okay, to Joe's point about the carrot and the stick, if we can agree there's going to be a transition point, can we put the stick away for a second and perhaps start to reduce some of those milestones from 2050 to 2030 to the next 2 years? What are we as a business, what are we as an industry going to do to advance this by X amount and start to take smaller chunks of this? So, you know, ultimately, I think it does come back to, can't do that until you can get everyone speaking the same language, until you know how you're going to measure success. And then you can start to break it down into smaller milestones.
I guess, Todd, what you've done there is you've kind of revealed the elephant in the room, and then said, and we need to eat an elephant one bite at a time, because it's the elephant in the room is that we have to keep the economies rolling, and so this has to be a transition. So we can't switch from being carbon intensive to carbon neutral overnight, because that just isn't going to happen, and it's going to create a whole load of S problems by solving the E problem. We have to make sure that businesses are able to seize the moment now and start to innovate, but we also have to make sure that there's enough capital and liquidity to enable them to be able to innovate, because innovation is something that in the long run, lots of innovations fail, lots of technologies fail, and so there's a huge industry that needs to build up around all of this, around the venture capital that's actually funding the innovation and ideas. And the other big risk, as far as I can see it, and I think this probably goes back to the points that Andrew is trying to cover off in the work with the ICC, is that if we are too complicated, then we overregulate. And then we end up with a bigger stick and huge compliance problems within banks, which actually mean that, you know, they become massively complicated to implement. Andrew, was that something that came through the work that you did?
Not just from the bank side, but actually from corporates. So we spoke with a number of major corporates who had tried to implement in partnership with major banks supply chain finance schemes linked to the sustainability performance of their SME suppliers. In each case, the multinational found that the requirements, particularly around reporting, were just too difficult for the SMEs to comply with. And therefore they said, okay, nice to get a bit of a discount on our supply chain finance, but actually this is just too much for us to bear. So we'll go down the road to the bank who usually finances our trade activities, and we'll get our usual rates. So we're very, very conscious of the need for this to be workable, not just from a bank compliance perspective, not just from a multinational perspective, but actually down and through supply chains. And I think the point around transition is right. And it's not just about the transition to a zero carbon economy by 2050 or a net zero economy by 2050, but actually it's about how do you enable an effective transition throughout supply chains on the full dimensions, the ESG dimensions of sustainability. And the one thing we've been very conscious of, and I hope this will come through when everyone sees the framework, is the need to ensure that in implementing a new standard around sustainability, we don't penalize existing financing, nor do we penalize anything that would actually enable the transition. So it's good to reward things that are positively, actively sustainable, but actually you can't penalize the things that are transitional, and actually it would be perverse to penalize things that today are essential business as usual.
I think that's really to Joe's point about using a carrot, hopefully an organic one that's been grown without fertilizers. But I mean, you know, that's Joe's point about having a carrot in this situation, that we need something that is going to incentivize people to change their behaviors. And we're talking about something that is overturning to a very large extent 250 years of industrial development. So this is about a whole new paradigm, isn't it? And introducing a whole new paradigm because we're suddenly cutting methane emissions at a policy level is a very, very difficult thing to do. Joe, what are the carrots that we can use? And I would say to everybody, this is a working lunch, so if you want to take the mic and give our speakers a chance to have a slurp of tea or a bite of a sandwich, then do chip in, just raise your hand and come into the session as well, because we welcome contributions. But Joe, what carrots can we be using?
Definitely organic ones. That much is for sure. So I would like to distinguish maybe between what I would call hard carrots, to stick with that, and softer ones. And when I think about the industry we work in, if I'm thinking about hard carrots, then certainly there is proper sort of like cash incentives, I would say, in terms of, again, talking about risk ratings, capital weightings, cost of balance sheet. So if there's things that we can do around that, and I know this is a superb challenge considering what certain regulators, and we have seen that in the Dear CEO letter from the PRA and the FCA, what certain regulators' current perception is of trade finance as a whole. So we'd certainly have an uphill battle there to fight if we want to argue for better ratings there. Although I guess we could, well, part of the argument is certainly that where we want to argue for better ratings, we certainly and better ratings, we certainly need strong reporting and strong MI to support that, and that, and again, should help the risk profile of trade finance as such, right? So I'd say there is definitely a massive field to work on, and I obviously know that the ICC has done a lot of good work around that already, and BAFT, and we certainly want to chip in from the ITFA membership perspective where we can. Then I'd say the other sort of like harder carrot is definitely around, we're talking about transition and adaptation, and I'd simply say that from a risk profile, companies that completely fail on the ESG, they're going to be increasingly facing a difficult environment to operate in, and that of course hardens their risk profile. Whereas you would hope that companies that are really having a positive impact will actually have a much lower risk profile, and that again, from a financial services perspective, of course, makes sense to go with those companies that offer us a lower risk profile at the end of the day. So that's, I say, where I put some of the hard carrots, and then maybe some of the soft ones is certainly, it's around general, that I think we've grown from sort of like a world of where we had some CSR policy somewhere on the website that somebody could click on, and it was all very wishy-washy and back to the blah blah, to there being a lot more hard facts and a lot more of hard commitments from institutions, and ultimately we'll all be measured against it. And that's again, I think it's the people that Andrew's having right outside his car at the moment that will continue to call for action. There's a lot of activists out there, and simply, I mean, that again sounds like a stick, but I think at the same time it also can be a good carrot to be actually the good citizen in the room, and therefore get sort of like the praise for actually positive action. And then ultimately, I'd also say with the generation that we have out there, and with sort of like again, one of the things that I always see as a massive risk to financial services as a whole is having the future generations on board in terms of having the future talent. And I'd say it's an ever more increasing theme and topic. I remember in the past interviewing graduates who really, for them, it was key what a company was doing around their ESG policy, their CSR policies. And I'd say, therefore, to also have the future generation of talent in this industry, that's another sort of like incentive.
It's really exciting, actually. I mean, if you put it all like that, Joe, it's about understanding how a future generation and a current generation at the moment is thinking about the financial services sector, and whether or not it becomes an attractive source of employment in the future, because it has adapted its business model to encourage sustainability in the round through supply chains. And I guess my sort of $1 trillion question right now is, well, after the global financial crisis, we found ourselves in a situation in the banking sector, and I say we in a very loose sense, but as the villains of the piece, because of investments that have been made. And the whole global financial crisis was because of misunderstanding technology, fraud, etc., short selling. It was just the huge complexity in it had become disconnected from the real world. We've had 10-12 years since the global financial crisis for banks to adjust their business models, adjust their credit ratios, their liquidity liquidity, actually come into the pandemic in a very positive way, in a very robust framework, having made some very, very hard choices over the last 10 years. Is it now the moment? And this, I'm speaking to people who are directly involved with business and banking now. Is now the right moment for banks to say, actually, we're going to come out of this pandemic, if not smelling of roses, at least making sure that we have made a difference and we have the mechanisms in place to make a difference in the future?
I mean, I would definitely say absolutely 100% yes. So, and I'm not just saying that from what, of course, I hear here within the organization, but from what we would hear throughout the work we're doing with ITFA, etc. I'd say now is definitely a key point in time where this would absolutely make sense. And we have seen it, to be fair, from some institutions more eloquently put out there than from others, but I'd say a lot of them all mean the same thing. It's still again around again making sure that it doesn't just sound like a bit of blah blah, but that it really is meaningful. And I think that's where maybe that's one of the challenges that's still ahead. But yeah, I would definitely say absolutely now is the right time.
So I mean, I guess just as we're beginning to draw the conversation to a close, and I'm very conscious of the fact that the audience hasn't come in. Do tell us if you raise your hand if you want to say something. But I guess we've talked about the need to standardise. Do we know why we're standardising? Andrew, why are we standardising? What is it? What problem are we trying to solve? Are we trying to nudge behaviours? Are we trying to make life better? Are we trying to change the planet? Or are we actually just trying to transition? Is it a more focused way through?
So I think it's potentially all of the above. I think the one of the core drivers for this work, in our view, and maybe some of our members would dispute this, is we see standardization as an antidote to claims, rightly, wrongly, of greenwashing, particularly by the financial sector. I think there was a great headline in the FT a few years ago that I read, "Lies, Lies, and ESG," and that's kind of, I think, where we're at potentially. And we've spoken to banks who will deem certain trades sustainable that we know civil society would deem to be completely unsustainable. Likewise, their competitors in the market would say, well, we would never say that, I don't know, sale of fossil fuels to X country is net sustainable because of its economic impacts. So I think there's an absolute need for some degree of standardization within the market. And I think that standardization then allows us to take further steps. So our hope with this is we release a consultation paper on Wednesday for 2 to 3 months. We bring in feedback not only from industry, but we'll also go out to civil society, to UN institutions. We hope as we iterate the framework, we can actually begin to standardize the market in a way that builds trust, in a way that starts to reward genuinely positive activity. And hopefully within that, we can then start to collect data through the ICC trade register to actually prove the often advanced case that sustainable transactions are better from a credit perspective. And if they are, then I think there's a legitimate discussion to be had, to Tod's point, on the basis of hard data, that Basel should in some way recognize or reward transactions that do meet certain sustainability criteria. So I think if we want to get this to this end point of having carrots that actually encourage the market to move towards global sustainability goals, then we need to start with a degree of standardization. And our view is that that standardization crucially has to be defined by the people who will ultimately implement it and by the people who do understand trade, not bureaucrats, not civil society campaigners.
I think all of those points are extremely well made. And, if we understand that what we're trying to do is integrate and change behaviours, but integrate those behaviour changes into the credit system. I'd say one other thing from all the research that I've done over the years, if you look, and this links to the point that Joe was making, if you look at how the companies that are more competitive and have higher productivity, then they are always the ones that manage their intangibles well. In other words, how they manage their people, how they manage innovation, how they manage the environment around them and the communities that they're working with. They are always the ones that have the higher G content, if you like. They have the higher governance content. They always have higher profitability but higher productivity as well. So, you know, that work has been going on for 20 years now, so that we understand the importance from an economics point of view of managing intangibles like this. But Tod, who's going to be left out of all of this? Are there organisations, you know, we've talked about carrots, and carrots that people want to eat, effectively soft carrots and hard carrots that people actually want to change their behaviours in order to be able to eat them. But are there organisations or types of organisations, particularly SMEs in emerging markets, that are going to get left out, do you think?
Yeah, so this is where the pessimist in me starts to come out again, right? So one of the problems that we've been trying to help with, and that still persists over many years, has been this topic of derisking and financial inclusion. And what I'm seeing is a big flashing light that says, you know, similar to cybersecurity a few years back, where I see ESG as being potentially a new frontier that could spark another level of de-risking, if you will, or financial exclusion, which is if institutions are led to believe that showing leadership means that you need to exit certain types of business or certain types of clients, then you have just defined who your losers will be, right? And unless you have provided a path for those that will be deemed losers in this to ultimately transition, then you have just signed some organization's death certificate, right? So I think it's massively important that banks have started to do what they have, which is to define what good looks like from a sustainability point of view. I think that it was great that the ICC did some work to come up with due diligence guidance and standards that could be adopted and onboarded by banks. But my caution would be, we need to use that in much more of a carrot fashion in the near term, before we get to a point where this turns into a financial exclusion problem that undermines all of this.
Which is ultimately the compliance risk, isn't it? If we become, if our carrots turn into sticks all of a sudden, i.e. they get too hard. So we're getting really rubbish with these analogies, but I mean, but if our carrots become too hard and they become sticks, then it's become a compliance problem, and people, particularly small businesses, are excluded from all of that.
Yeah. And I think that you may have referenced the BCG study that estimated, you know, I think it was $50 trillion worth of investment that's going to be required in order to get SMEs the curve on this. You know, I mean, $50 trillion is a big number, and
twice the size of world trade.
Right. And so my experience has always been, we tend to underestimate the amount of investment it takes to get things done. So ultimately, we have to be really careful about where we draw the line and when we draw the line, because that loser pool could get bigger than we want it to be.
So I think that's incredibly important, and it points again to the importance of the S in ESG. And I think just as we're drawing this to a close, if each of you could tell me where we go next. So I mean, I will end up, because I'm going to abuse my position as chair quite horribly and give my view at the end, but where do we go now? What do we have to do next immediately? And we have climate goals that are being set by COP26 and that were set by Paris. So we've got those types of goals, those types of objectives. We know what the targets are. I suspect if we wait for policymakers to come along with the appropriate regulations, then that's going to take for ages. So what are the steps that we need to take to standardise metrics and work together over the next, so that by this time next year, instead of saying $1 in every 5 is linked to sustainability and 4 aren't, meaning that there's around $17 trillion worth of trade finance that needs to be made sustainable. Instead of that type of statistic, how wonderful would it be to say, well, actually, there's only $2.50 or $3 next year are sustainable. How do we get there? Who goes first? What a question. Tod.
So I'll jump in the water first. I think that I think the work that the ICC is doing right now is incredibly important, again, because it defines the language that we speak. And if we can, and we've seen this with supply chain definitions, for example, right? And until you get everyone speaking the same language, you can't figure out what you're talking about. So getting some definitions around sustainable trade and what is it not, I think is absolutely the right starting point. I think in parallel, we have to continue to do a tremendous amount of education, awareness, and getting organizations on board. What I heard was during Sibos Week, I heard 2 things. I heard that there are banks in certain parts of the world who say they cannot have a meeting with a corporate client where they're not talking about sustainability in some form or fashion. And then I heard some of those same banks tell me when they met with some of their banking partners, particularly in developing markets around the world, that this topic was nowhere near the top of their agenda. And so they didn't see a pathway for what they needed to be doing today to start this journey. So while the definitions work is going on, I think we still have a lot of work to do to get everyone in our community on board as to why this is important and what they can do to take that very first step.
Thank you. Andrew.
Big question, Rebecca. So I think
I'm good at
from our perspective, certainly it's the path towards standardization. And what we start on Wednesday, we see as a multi-year process, but at least we'll provide a platform to start that discussion around how do we define it and how do you actually implement a framework to measure or grade the sustainability of an individual transaction. I think the other thing that we need to do, and I think this is an extension of what Tod said, is actually to educate the outside world about the different dimensions of sustainability when it comes to trade. So we don't just focus on climate or environmental issues, but we actually think about the S and the G. And I think also to actually make sure that policymakers understand the complexity of applying sustainability considerations or frameworks in a trade environment. And we've had a number of conversations with policymakers, particularly in Europe, who simply say, well, there's a standard for green bonds. Why can't you apply that to trade? So I think we need to make sure that policymakers really understand the complexities of trade and also its multifaceted dimensions beyond the environment.
Thank you. Jo, last word to you. Almost last word.
Well, almost last words, and I definitely don't want to take time from you, Rebecca, because I think both Tod and Andrew have summed it up perfectly well. Again, we're coming back to the standardization, and maybe I can use an analogy that Gwyn made this morning around we are not traveling around the world on different passports in each country that we enter, but we have one passport, and that's sort of like where we need to get to, I'd say, in terms of standardization. And definitely education on the one hand amongst our community as well, to really get everybody to collaborate, because I think that only comes when people really buy into the idea and don't just roll their eyes and go like, oh, here we go again on the ESG topic. And then certainly, as Andrew is saying, on educating policymakers, etc. So we don't just get the bureaucrats out there to tell us how something has to be done or not be done. And then I think it's about looking into the future. I'd say it's also about working and identifying with particularly, I'd say, tech companies or technology solutions that can help us on that way. For example, with better data, with better reporting, etc. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. And thank you very much for this talk today. That was great.
Well, thank you to all three of you for an absolutely fabulous session. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I would say the immediate next step is obviously to keep listening to the rest of Future of Strategy and to work with us in our consortium, our Cosmos consortium, for the very simple reason that we want to work with everybody. We're not competing with anybody, but we're hoping that we can provide a standardization solution that people can start to implement. We can't do that without everybody working with us. I think the most important thing from all of this that I take away is that we're all on a journey. We're all at the beginning of that journey, but we all want to get to the end of it and make that journey a sustainable one with greater sustainability coming back this time next year and saying actually $2 in every 5 are now sustainable. Thank you very much indeed for your time. And the next session starts at 2:30, where we'll be talking about the geopolitics of all of this. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.